Okay, so my name is Jordache Ellapen. I am originally from South Africa. I've been living in North America on and off since 2006. I did most of my graduate training in the United States, and I arrived in Canada to teach at the University of Toronto in 2018. So I'm an assistant professor of feminist studies in culture and media.
Wow. What does that entail?
At the University of Toronto. Well, still trying to figure that out, but I feel like
that's good.
I do something that resonates with culture, media, and feminist and queer work. So
wow.
Yeah.
What is one of your particular areas of focus within that kind of large body of work?
Yeah. So currently, like one of my main areas of focus is thinking through race and sexuality in South Africa. So I'm really interested in post-apartheid South African society and the ways in which we think about freedom in the post-apartheid period as related to race, gender, and sexuality.
Wow.
And the book that I'm working on now, I'm revising actually at the moment, is a book that brings together artists who are Black African and Afro-Indian to really think about Afro-Indian intimacies and Southern African Blackness.
Wow.
And the relationship between Indianness and Blackness in the long history of colonialism and apartheid and the post-apartheid period.
What an enormous project. That is like how far along are you in your book project?
So I'm revising. Hopefully this will be the last draft.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. Congrats.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm grappling with is how do we understand Blackness from a South African perspective in a more complex way, given the very large history and long history of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And the book really tries to grapple with this by thinking through what I refer to as Afro-Indian Intimacies as a way to really think about the relationship between Blackness in South Africa and Indianness, but also as a way to critique how Blackness itself has shifted since the apartheid period, where we've always understood Blackness as a collective site through which freedom could be imagined. And what I've noticed, or what I'm kind of like critiquing in the book, is how in the post-apartheid period, Blackness becomes attached to a kind of like dangerous normative and nativist understanding of who is authentically Black.
Right.
And
sorry, don't mind my cat.
And so a lot of the work that I'm drawing on, draws on or is influenced, for instance, by Steve Biko's notions of Black consciousness, which came about in the 70s, where Blackness was understood as beyond racial ethnic identities.
Right.
And Blackness was understood as a collective, as a site of collectivity that brought together the different marginalized sections of South Africa's populations, like Black Africans, Indians, and colored people who are mixed race people, into this category Black. And Biko's philosophies were not perfect. There were a lot of like masculinist tendencies in his work, but he also offered a way to think collectively outside of the kind of restrictions placed on South Africa's populations through the very kind of like rigid management of race, through very stark kind of like marking the boundaries of who is Black, who is Indian, who is colored, who is white, right? So we live with that legacy, but it seems as though something else has happened with Blackness after 1994, where it's become the marker of who is the authentic national subject and who belongs, who can claim belonging to the land.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's part a history as well as it is a contemporary study.
It's a contemporary study in the sense that I look at contemporary artists, and most of the artists I look at, like some of them coming to political consciousness in the I would say the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, as the apartheid state was starting to disintegrate, and as we were transitioning into a democratic country.
Right.
So the focus is on artists and aesthetic practices after 1994.
Okay.
But part of what I do is that in order to understand both what the artists are doing and why I'm curating a particular relationship between Black African and Afro-Indian artists, it requires us to understand a larger history of South Africa that goes back to slavery in the Cape. Right. In the 1600s, 1500s. So it goes back, but I wouldn't say it's a history. I wouldn't say it's it doesn't just give you the history, but it does give you the context in order to understand why we require different frameworks to understand not just race in South Africa, but also how we understand Afro-Indian relations.
Can you tell me a bit more about how intimacy, like as a nexus point, how are you looking at intimacy? How are you defining intimacy? And how is that framing your project?
Yeah. So intimacy to me operates on various levels in the project, right? So number one, I'm interested in the intimate domain of the domestic. I'm interested in intimacies between bodies. So I'm interested in intimacy as a site to think through the erotic, to think through sexuality, to think about what happens when differently kind of racialized bodies, and in this particular case study, when Black African and Afro-Indian bodies come together. So we have intimacy, which is about, the erotic, about the body, about the libidinal. And then you also have the intimacy that, a lot of queer studies scholars, particular queer color scholars, and other kinds of scholars like Lisa Lowe, for instance, talks about the intimacies of 4 continents, really thinking through the relationships between different coercive labor practices. And how, for instance, indentureship in South Africa is directly related to transatlantic slavery, right? So the system of Asian/Indian indentureship that saw the relocation of people from the subcontinent more broadly to Mauritius, Southern Africa, the Pacific Islands, and the Caribbean islands, was implemented by the British after the abolition of slavery. So there's an intimacy between these coercive labor practices like slavery and indentureship that some of the normative frameworks of history and sociology don't allow us to see, because they're positioned in opposition to each other, and then the archives are also separated from each other. So we don't actually see, or we live in a world that doesn't see that the system of indentureship that was implemented after the abolition of slavery is actually part of the afterlife of slavery. Right. It's directly related to slavery. But within the racial logics of the modern world, we produce different kinds of of racial logics that get attached to different kinds of bodies, and through the different processes of history and migration and nationalism and all of these things, these bodies become totally separated. And we then are trained not to see how our histories and our bodies are so imbricated in ways that I don't think we fully understand as yet.
That is so cool. So it's not only, you're not only looking at intimacy in like the physical embodied world, but also intimacy between histories and concepts and theories. Wow, I'm really excited to read this book.
And continents and spaces and geographies. And I think there's so much you can do with intimacy that really takes us back to the body, but takes us to other regimes and systems and stuff like that. And I think with South Africa, it's like, it becomes really more important within the South African context because of how apartheid as a system, a structure, a policy of separateness, was about not allowing people to see how they related to each other on various intimate levels, right? So it's like really about like separating racial groups, and at the heart of it was anxieties over interracial mixing and interracial sex. Right? Because it's about maintaining a particular kind of purity around whiteness. But in order to do that, you had to kind of create these racial categories and then justify how you put people into these categories. Right.
And this is something that Abdi was also actually talking about in his episode. Like there's an idea of what blackness is, like kind of like, a visual idea, and brownness as separate, but then also imbricated in it in this sense. Like what is an Afro-Indian identity? Like how is that shaping up in your text and your research?
Right. So I specifically use the term Afro-Indian in my work because the category Indian was a racial category during apartheid. And so we were racialized as Indian.
Right.
And then migrating or coming to North America, like you get this big category South Asian. And then here's also like, the relationship between race and the look. So anyone who sees me sees a South Asian body and automatically interpolates me into the category South Asian.
Right.
But the category South Asian is a very specific geopolitical category that is very North American also. And it references a particular history of migration that does not map on so easily onto like the colonial era migrations. So on one level, like the Indian diasporas of the colonial era, right? The populations that were distributed through the system of indentured labor is oftentimes a kind of like hidden kind of like presence.
Right.
And there's a lot of erasure that happens even when these diasporic populations are just collapsed into this category South Asian. And so part of my work like resists this kind of like conflation of Indianness or South African Indianness into this category of the South Asian. I did think about brownness a lot, and what brownness means. And I've often used brownness as a way to disidentify with South Asianness.
Okay.
But I feel like brownness, there's like a lot of other things happening with brownness, particularly in the North American context.
Right.
And brownness didn't really get me to a kind of like understanding of what does it mean to be an African, not just of Indian origin, but an African of Indian indenture heritage. And so I've gravitated a lot to the term Afro-Indian.
Right.
as a way of also troubling who is an African. Right? Because, whether it's in popular culture or academic discourse or just within the kind of like global imaginary of Africa, the Afro-Indian body can't exist because it often rubs against this notion of Africanness and who is the authentic African subject that can lay claim to the post-colonial nation state, right? And so a lot of my, I've always been thinking about what happens when we start really thinking about racialized Africanness. Because Africa is not a homogeneous continent, right? Africa's and also the Indian population, for instance, in South Africa, is also not a homogeneous community. It's a highly diverse, heterogeneous community in terms of histories of migration, in terms of class and capital, in terms of language, in terms of region. There's, Indianness is regionally inflected. Indianness sounds differently as you travel across the landscape of South Africa. Indianness starts looking differently also. So the book really tries to tease apart not just Blackness, but this very category of what we've come to know as the Indian.
Wow.
And to me, it's there's been a lot of work done, academic scholarly work done on Indians in South Africa. A lot of it is within the social sciences, history and sociology, anthropology. But I feel like the aesthetic does something else. The aesthetic allows us to see and imagine differently. And I feel like the aesthetic takes us to a different place. And that is why I've always been drawn to artists and aesthetic practices from photography, film, fine art, performance. I feel like there's something that it does that these other more traditional disciplines can only get us to a certain point.
I would totally agree. I have a few questions popping up. Maybe first, because you just mentioned your inspiration from the aesthetic and from artists. You recently co-organized a symposium called Visualizing Pleasure and Practices of Freedom, a South-North dialogue. And I was wondering, because you were asking the questions, not being questioned throughout the day, but, obviously pleasure and freedom are so important to your work. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking also the way that there's, obviously a history of freedom, that you're looking at, but then also exploding categories kind of, and freedom from these categories. So anyway, I'm rambling, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how pleasure and freedom interact with your work and inspire you.
So I feel like some of my new work is pushing more towards really thinking about pleasure and race and freedom.
My cat is on one.
She's so cute. So I think a lot of the new work is going there. I feel like the book doesn't, it deals with pleasure in some parts of it, but pleasure is not one of the framing devices. But I think coming from a South African context, we've always understood freedom and the practice of freedom as embedded within a kind of spectacle of apartheid. So it's the fight against apartheid. It's the marches against apartheid. It's the
Nelson Mandela giving a speech and the very spectacular kind of
so
moments.
It's the big spectacular kind of performative aspects of gesturing towards agitating for freedom. And I feel like that's important. But what I'm really interested in is what we do with our bodies as a site of freedom.
Cool.
Because oftentimes, like, and South Africa is a good example of this, but also I feel like other countries and other spaces like Canada also, our freedoms are often written into like the Constitution, right? Or within policy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like South Africa was was the first country in the world to embed kind of like sexual rights into its constitution.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like in the early 90s. So sexual rights was pivotal to how we imagined freedom in that moment. It was totally imbricated to like racial freedom, right? Because the fight was freedom from racial oppression.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that the everyday lived experiences of particularly Black and other people of color, particularly women, queers, femmes, trans people, gender non-conforming people, accessing freedom it's not so easy.
Right.
But what I'm interested in is how the body and embodiment becomes a site through which freedom is enacted and exercised.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like the body and pleasure does something differently and wants us to think about freedom differently. And what that differently is, I'm still trying to figure out. but
I'm excited to keep
feel
hearing.
like it's working with and through the body and bodies coming together that we will understand freedom.
Right.
Because I feel like artists are doing it already.
Yeah.
And I also feel like the ways in which people live outside of these categories and outside of these expectations and outside of these kinds of like normativities that actually like capture the body.
Right. Right.
And I feel like pleasure is something that can push us beyond that. And also, I'm thinking about pleasure, like drawing on a very kind of like Black feminist genealogy.
Right.
I'm not really convinced around the kind of like work around pleasure and psychoanalysis, right?
Sure.
I think it needs to be complicated.
Right. Like Audre Lorde's, the use of the erotic as, democratizing radical, like a force for the powers that be to fear almost, right?
But also asking us to feel differently.
Right.
And I think that's what pleasure does.
Mm-hmm.
To feel differently, we have to evoke law to feel across our differences.
Yeah.
But I feel like we need something else to think through the world of difference. I think the frameworks that we have, most of it is exhausted.
Exhausted or exhausting? Exhausted.
Both.
Yeah. Okay. True. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's fascinating. That really is fascinating. I'm thinking too, just about, like, this is, I think, maybe pretty Foucauldian, but the body is such a locus for freedom, and, pleasure and freedom are obviously so connected. All you need to do is take a look at how much imposition there is by normative bodies upon our body to realize like the radical potential of our own pleasure,
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And I think also defining, pleasure is different for different peoples and different bodies. And so I'm like very drawn to visual cultures.
Mm-hmm.
That's, my training and my work, but I'm very drawn to certain kinds of visual cultures. And so I do talk a little bit about pleasure in some of the work that I've done with Farga. I'm trying to think about, what would it mean to create an archive that foregrounds pleasure.
Right.
In this chapter that I'm currently kind of like working through. And also like, it's really interesting because I feel like a lot of African feminists and, like my work is, a lot of it it's South, like my space that I work with is in South Africa. And a lot of South African feminists, Black feminists have, written about pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the dangerous thing about writing about pleasure is that the biopolitical doesn't allow us to think about pleasure, right? Because when we think about gender and sexuality, particularly as it relates to African bodies, it's about population control and birth rate and all these kinds of like statistics and biopolitical management of the body. And then with the South African case, it gets a little bit more complicated because of the HIV/AIDS epidemic,
right,
which has disproportionately affected Black African people. So to talk about Black pleasure in a context like that it's very contested. But I feel like we need to have more conversations around pleasure.
For exactly
because
that
reason.
I
think pleasure is about and being able to access pleasure and to understand what pleasure does. It's not just, power and energy, but I think it's also about humanness.
Yeah, right.
And, it's about this kind of like reconnecting. And, like Faga's work is so interesting, right? Because, and, with the Visualizing Pleasure conference that you evoked, pleasure does more than just like connecting us to each other, but it's also about connecting us to the realm beyond, right? The spiritual realm.
Absolutely.
And I feel like there's like artists are helping us think through some of these things. And for me specifically, it is the work of Faga.
I was going to ask, so you have 2 recent articles on the work of Faga, and I was wondering if you could just contextualize a bit about who Faga is and what their work is, and just say a little bit more about like what drew you to them as artists specifically.
So I won't, I think it'd be, I won't tell you too much about Faga, but what I will say is that Faga is a Black queer femme performance duo. They consist of 2 main performers, Fela Gucci and Desire Maria, and who come together under this larger umbrella called Faga. And what I've been really drawn to is the expansiveness of their aesthetic practices.
Cool.
From photography to performance, like live performance art, music and sound art. And what really drew me to their work was their use of excess and abjection.
Cool.
And so, they really take excess and they draw it out. So they do have like one performance called Bottom's Revenge, where they perform a sex scene in an anus, right? And really thinking about the excesses and the abjection of not just Black queer bodies, but Black queer sex and how disruptive it is to the kind of like heteronormative, homonormative project of like securing a popular kind of subjecthood within the kind of like terrain of the nation. And it has a particular valence within Africa, within the kind of like African Black kind of like post-colonial nation, where same-sex desires are positioned as inauthentically African, as un-African, and as a disruption to the project of African sovereignty.
Right, like it's a colonial import. And nothing else. Right.
And so what that does is it kind of like erases and invisibilizes a whole history of like same-sex practices on the continent that never needed to be codified and never needed to be categorized and never needed to be structured around like an identity.
Right.
And I think that's what pleasure does. It gets us to think outside of these categories, to think about bodies as bodies outside of these imputed racial, gender, sexual, class, and other kinds of like categories.
I'm wondering, that kind of leads me to the other thing I was going to ask. So I'm interviewing you in your capacity at the Queer Trans Research Lab, and the language of queerness, and what am I exactly trying to ask you? Like in this in this project that I'm also seeing as kind of a project of reclamation and freedom making, and looking at the potential of aesthetics. How is the language of queerness like working for or against you? Like, is there a tension there for you? Especially just as you were saying, like these same-sex practices were, in existence and didn't need to be named.
Right.
So like, how is that at play in your book, in your project?
I think in the book, like I use intimacy a lot.
Right.
And I do I do examine the artworks and the performances and, the practices of queer identified artists and artists who don't talk about their sexuality.
Right.
Right. So there's this kind of like interesting way in which some artists, especially some of the women artists that I look at, don't feel the need to name or talk or categorize in terms of like sexuality. And then there's like the more kind of like, the other artists that I'm looking at who identify as queer, who identify, in multiple ways in terms of sexuality, as queer, as trans, as femme, as gender non-conforming.
Right.
And so, as a person of color, like I've always found that this category of queerness oftentimes rubs against, it's not an easy category. It rubs against like many things. Because I feel like even the term queerness has a particular kind of like genealogy. And then to be a proper queer subject, you have to fall within this kind of particular genealogy.
Right.
And that genealogy doesn't fit for a lot of us who come from somewhere else.
Right.
Right. And so we have our own genealogies. And I think some of us are creating our own genealogies to really think about sexuality and queerness and feminist outside of these kind of like Euro-American Western categories.
Yeah.
Like, so for instance, in the book, what I'm really interested in a lot of the chapters is my own kind of like creative work and how I constantly return to the sugarcane plantations and thinking about queerness more broadly rather than just, as an attachment to particular kinds of acts and behaviors and bodies.
Yeah.
But really thinking about queerness and the queerness of the sugarcane plantations and the queerness of like the kind of lives that inhabited those spaces and the ghosts that remain within those spaces.
Wow.
As a kind of genealogy that I'm still trying to think through.
Yeah.
Like, I want to think through my queerness as arising out of the sugarcane plantations, out of the kind of like coercive labor practices embedded deeply within this kind of like very rural space. And a lot of it is really informed by my mother, actually. And her relationship to things like fashion and beauty and creativity and femininity that arises out of the space of violence and lack, right? It's a violent space, like any other kind of like plantation logic.
Yeah.
But it's a violence that we've kind of been strategically kind of, we've kind of invisibilized it because we are more interested in kind of this narrative of progress and development.
Right.
So we have to subsume or submerge a lot of this violent history in order to secure a kind of like belonging to the nation.
You you have a work called, is it the Brown Family Photo Album? Is that the title of it?
Yes.
And those are archival photographs of your mother, correct? Is that what was that like for you compiling those photos? Like, what does that project mean to you?
So I think the Brown Photo Album became like a really important project to think about Afro-Indian femininity and what does it mean for, a woman of indenture origin and like literally one generation removed from the sugarcane plantations and the coal mines,
right?
Where her parents kind of worked as an indentured labor force. Like, what did it mean for, this woman from rural KwaZulu-Natal to create this archive through photographs. And so, and it goes back to pleasure, it goes back to the body, it goes back to performance. Cool. And there was something about this archive that spoke to me in various ways, but also like I knew there was something happening there that I don't think my mother understood or I understood, like when I first encountered it. And it like, it like lived in our family home for like years until I actually brought it to Canada, this archive. But it also became a kind of like way to understand gender-based violence within the space of the the indentured family.
Right.
And so what like really interested me about this archive was like, as my mother started getting older, was how every time we returned to these photographs, it always evoked like memories of gender-based violence in a home. And so my mother was like the youngest, the second youngest child of like 10 children. And her siblings were significantly like older than her.
Okay.
And so she witnessed like violence and the death of siblings because of gender-based violence. Oh. And so one of the things I kind of like began to understand was that my mother understood the precariousness of life, of being a woman in a community like this, and how your future wasn't secure. Because most women were like dying in their 20s.
Jesus.
Like from gender-based violence, from getting sick, from, just not getting the right kind of care they needed from their husbands who kind of like felt they owned them.
Right.
And these were like things that were happening within the extended family. And so I felt like my mother understood, that there, as Indian women or Afro-Indian women, which was how I would refer to it, they understood like the way in which like life and death coexisted.
Wow. And
so the photographs became for her a way of like living a kind of futurity in the present.
Whoa. That's beautiful.
That's drawing from Tina Camp.
Cite your sources.
Yeah.
I love that. So that's one of the ways I'm guessing that masculinity enters your thought process and your work, right? In this way of alternatives to kind of like a violent heteropatriarchy.
Right.
Is that correct? And
yeah,
assuming?
I think like this project has really forced me to think about masculinity. And my own relationship to masculinity.
Right.
And what really and what I understood was that I couldn't be a femme child. Or I was a femme child. I was very femme until like I finished, I completed high school. But then we also understand that femme boys are subject to a lot of violence, right?
Right.
And a lot of regulation, whether it's within the home space, within the church, within the school grounds, within the classroom itself. And so you have to start embodying a particular kind of masculinity.
Right.
And so when I went to university, the first thing I did was go to the gym because I was a very frail, small, I don't know how to describe it, very small, I'm very small framed. I was like not, I didn't have a lot of muscle mass. And then the university I went to was in Johannesburg, the University of the Witwatersrand. And, Joburg is a rough city, right? And the university is in the city center, and I lived in that area. And so one of the ways in which I had to protect myself was to reimagine my body as a masculine body.
Wow.
To ward off certain kinds of danger, right? I don't know how successful it was in the end. But that's when I started thinking about masculinity and thinking about, working out and looking aggressive and looking if someone looked at me or stopped me in the streets, I want to give off this impression, don't fuck with me because I will fuck you up.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have to do that kind of like performance almost. But then I'm, and then I kind of like naturalize it, and I didn't really realize that in my own kind of like articulation of a masculinity, I became very femphobic, right? And so then part of what I had to do, and a lot of it happened, like I would say in the last maybe 10 years, is to unlearn that.
Right.
And to really grapple with like how much you have to give up to survive in these kind of like violent worlds. And so, and to really grieve also the kind of like loss of a particular kind of femme beauty.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah, the erasure.
And the erasure of it. And I think like it's like a journey, right? Because it's like you don't realize you are doing things until like you've done it, and then until you like sit and reflect on it, and you're like, oh, so that's what that was about.
Yeah, I totally. There's some moments in my past that this is resonating with for sure.
And so now like and I think that's also why I'm so attracted to like the work of Faga or even Gittin Kupu, for instance. And like, because now I've come to understand that it doesn't have to be this kind of like binary between masculinity and femininity,
right.
And that actually the both can coexist and can create beautiful worlds in that coexistence. And I feel like that's what I'm like much more invested in now.
Cool.
That's
so cool. There's so much of freedom just like pulsing through everything that you're saying. I'm fascinated by it. I won't take up too much more of your time. But I'm curious, as somebody who, is trained in like visual cultures and media, do you find writing restrictive? Like is it hard for you? Are you using images throughout your book? Like, what's that relationship like for you?
So the book is very image heavy.
Okay.
Right. So from the first page, I think from the cover to the end, it's going to be full of images.
Awesome.
So I was trained, my undergraduate training was in an art school. It was in the Wits School of Arts. And so my introduction to like art was always in relationship to theory.
Right.
And so so that was my initial training. I was always drawn to kind of like art making and an art practice. But I quickly realized at university that in order to be an artist, or, to want to be an artist, I would say, you needed two things. You needed to be comfortable with who you are, right? And I wasn't at that stage. And you needed money, right? And I didn't have that kind of like security. So I kind of gravitated more towards the academic side. But I kind of shifted around like 2009. I shifted to seriously thinking about an art practice. And so I make art and I write in relationship to each other.
Cool.
And I find that, like the academic work sometimes, like language always has a limit. And I found that I needed something else to work alongside that. And so I've been making art since, like 2009, engaging in various different kinds of projects. One big project does kind of like deal with the family album and stuff like that. And then working through the revisions for this book, I've realized like there's more art making that I want to do.
Cool. Yeah.
And a lot of it still relates to, Afro-Indian relations and the history of indentureship, but also like really thinking about pleasure and what happens when we add pleasure to these different ways. I'm thinking about race and these kind of labor practices, but also thinking about how pleasure can be a different way to bring these different racialized bodies together. And I'm more particularly thinking about like what would it look like aesthetically.
Right.
And so I think, like there's for for me, there's always a relationship. I haven't been able to like separate the two.
Yeah, I find similarly, I need both.
Yeah.
Like the words, I'm so aware of the restriction behind the words, and totally. What's your preferred medium for art creation?
I like photography.
Cool.
I really like photography, and I always think to myself, if I could do it all over again, I would have been a photographer.
I mean, you are a photographer, right?
Like a professionally trained photographer. So,
I mean, your photos are very professional looking. I love that. Okay, as we're closing in on this academic year, the inaugural year of the Queer Trans Research Lab, I'm wondering what has it brought for you and what has it meant for you to be a part of this lab?
To me, it's, it was really about supporting the vision of creating a kind of like experimental space that's both inside the university but also that functions alongside it.
Right.
And I think like this has been the most amazing year because the kind of revisions I needed on a very practical level, like the kind of revisions that this book needed, required the kind of like total attention and immersion in the project that I would not have been able to do if I was like still teaching.
Yeah, right.
So on that very practical level, it's been one of the most amazing and generative like times in this writing process.
That's
for
amazing.
This project. But I think also just being part of this community and like meeting people and connecting with people, because I feel like that's the other thing, right? Like we need to do is to meet and connect, but also to think and create together. And I feel like that's what this lab is. It's allowing for the possibilities for that to actually happen. And I think that's really important.
I agree. I love that. Also in a pandemic year, it was just so important to stay connected. Yeah, I think I took that for granted a lot. And as you're just saying that, I'm like, yeah, this would have been a very darker year for me if I wasn't a part of this lab. Well, that's lovely. Thank you so much, Jordache.
Thank you.
I look forward to reading your book when it comes out. I can't wait.
When it comes out.
Whenever it comes out. Amazing. Well, thank you.
This has been a QTRL production. Thanks for listening.